All right, we are moving into chapter 7, which is one of my favorite chapters because I am fascinated by psychopathy. Um, so, what is a psychopath? Now, I have mentioned previously we've kind of hit on psychopathy a little bit, but remember, psychopathy, being a psychopath, is not a clinical diagnosis with the American Psychiatric Association. It is a behavioral pattern that we would typically find under the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. So it is a person who demonstrates a discernible cluster of psychological, interpersonal, and neurophysiological features that distinguish him from the general population. That's according to Robert Hare, who is one of the leading researchers on psychopathy and really one of the experts. So it is a behavioral pattern that distinguishes people from the general population. There are a couple of different type of psychopaths that Hare has described. The primary, the secondary, and the dissocial. We really are concerned with the primary. That is what we would call a true a criminal psychopath, if you would. They have emotional differences, cognitive differences, biological and psychological differences from the general population. With secondary and dissocial, they definitely have those same behavioral patterns. They just tend to not cross into criminal behavior. And we're focusing on criminal behavior here in this chapter. So I mentioned that it is a behavioral pattern, and again, it would fall under the diagnostic category of antisocial personality disorder. Antisocial personality disorder, and remember we've talked about conduct disorder, is a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others since teenage years. Definitely crosses into criminal behavior. The hallmark of antisocial personality disorder is an inability to feel guilt, shame, or remorse, no empathy, sympathy, a lack of caring about other people. It can be very dangerous behavior. You can imagine if somebody has a lack of guilt, remorse, or shame and doesn't care about hurting other people, what kind of behaviors that they might engage in and have no problem with that. So when we have somebody that has antisocial personality disorder and is demonstrating a psychopathic behavioral pattern, they tend to be very charming, average to above average intelligence, friendly, outgoing, display many interests. They're verbally skillful. They're generally just very charming and engaging. And that's interesting because that actually kind of brings people in and makes people attracted to them. And in terms of criminal behavior, it makes it a little easier for them to find victims. They do score higher on intelligence tests, and there are definitely successful and non-successful psychopaths in terms of how well they're able to manipulate other people. The vast majority are actually pretty good at manipulating other people. When it comes to psychopaths and mental disorders, now, even though that qualifies as a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, they really do not exhibit any symptoms of any other types of mental disorders. They don't show symptoms of hallucinations, delusions. They tend to not suffer from things like depression or anxiety. They tend to be very cool and calm under pressure. There are some people that have argued psychopathy and schizophrenia are on the same spectrum, but I'm not a big proponent of that. Schizophrenia is having a split with reality. People that are schizophrenic, hear voices and have delusions and feel persecuted and things like that. People who are psychopaths are very much in control of their thoughts and behaviors. Other principal core traits that we find with psychopathy: selfish, inability to love or gain affection, very egocentric, flat affect. Remember, affect means emotions. So not normal emotional responses. They tend to have little contact with their family, disregard for the truth, unreliable, irresponsible, unpredictable. We talked about that lack of remorse, guilt, or shame. They tend to be sensation seekers, seeking out stimulation, things to keep them interested. Prevalence. Antisocial personality disorder with a psychopathy. All personality disorders tend to affect men more than they do women. And this is one of those. Antisocial personality disorder does affect men more than it does women. And the same would be for psychopathy. The prevalence is probably about 1% of the general population. And depending on the study that you read, anywhere from 15 to actually 60% of the prison population might qualify for a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. Now, even though we're focusing on criminal psychopathy, the criminal psychopath, not all psychopaths engage in antisocial or criminal behavior. Not all serious repeat offenders are psychopaths. Criminal psychopathy, for our purposes, are those psychopaths who demonstrate a wide range of persistent and serious antisocial behaviors. As a group, criminal psychopaths tend to be, as we've stated, dominant, manipulative, impulsive, risk takers, lead antisocial lifestyle, get pleasure from diverse sexual gratification and diverse victims. Hare estimates 1% of the population, and again, depending on the study, anywhere from 15 to, I've seen as high as 60% of the prison population. Criminal psychopaths are believed to be responsible for a disproportionate amount of crime. Most violent and persistent offenders are psychopaths. All serial killers, by the way, would qualify for a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder and are probably psychopathic. Tend to be sadistic and brutal. Serial murders get pleasure from both sexual and non-sexual suffering of victims. They often engage in revenge and retribution. Remember, they tend to engage in risky behavior, so it's not surprising that they would engage in revenge and retribution. Psychopathic rapists often have non-sexual motivation that includes anger, vindictiveness, sadism, and opportunism. Victims are often strangers, and that holds true for psychopathic rapists and serial killers as well. When it comes to recidivism rates, we tend to see pretty high rates of recidivism. Remember, we're talking about people that don't have the ability to feel that guilt, shame, and remorse that we talked about. They tend to reoffend faster. They violate parole sooner, and that includes both juvenile and adult offenders who are displaying that psychopathic behavioral pattern. Now, when measuring psychopathy, the PCLR is the most widely used instrument for measuring psychopathy. This was developed by Robert Hare, who we were just talking about a minute ago. He has a regular version, a short version, and a juvenile version. Now, when Hare created this checklist, he created it for use on the Canadian prison population. This was never designed to be something that measured people in the general population. Now, it's been revised since he originally created it, but kind of keep that in mind when you're reading about Hare's work. Most of his work has been done with the Canadian prison population. The PCL contains items that measure emotion, interpersonal behavior, and social deviance of criminal psychopathy from multiple sources, including self-reports, family reports, court, criminal records, and it has a particular score on it as 0 to 2 on each item. The use of criminal records allows to distinguish between criminal and non-criminal psychopaths. A score of 30 or above is a primary psychopath. Those are the ones that we worry about. 21 to 29, middle, show some but not all behavioral patterns, and below 21 on this would be a non-psychopath. I do have links to the Hare checklist in D2L, so make sure to check that out. I also, by the way, have the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual checklist for antisocial personality disorder as well. We talked about the scoring on that, and again, check that out in D2L. Now, I mentioned that they do tend to have higher recidivism rates. They did a couple of studies of 300 male offenders who were believed to be psychopaths. 8 years after release, 65% of the psychopaths were convicted again, compared to a control group of non-psychopaths, and only 25% of those were rearrested. Another study that was done in 1995 found that more than 80% of the psychopaths reoffended within 6 years. So very high recidivism rates, very dangerous criminal psychopaths. Now, criticisms of the PSLR. Remember, it was designed for the prison population. May not identify psychopaths who do not engage in criminal behavior. Those are all fair assessments. The boldness factor of psychopathy, they are fearless and have fearless dominance. They really do like to dominate their victims. Now, when it comes to non-criminal psychopaths, and you've probably seen things like this, there are people who are psychopaths who do not engage in criminal behavior. It's suggested that a lot of CEOs who really have to kind of be dominant and cutthroat and fearless, politicians, people who have that kind of as their core personality, could be psychopaths. They just never engage in criminal behavior. Tend to also be very mean, very arrogant, defiance of authority, get pleasure and satisfaction without the consideration of others. They like to direct their behavior at hurting others, especially when we're talking about criminal psychopaths and people like serial killers and sadistic rapists, for example. Now, with female psychopaths, a lot less prevalent than males. Remember, this falls under the category of antisocial personality disorder, and that is more often diagnosed in men than women. They tend to have lower scores, women, on the psychopathy checklist. They tend to have a history of numerous marital relationships, a wide range of crime, and tend to also have a history of abuse in early childhood. Female psychopaths do tend to have abnormally high levels of callousness, low levels of empathy. They tend to engage in relational aggression. Remember, that's not physical aggression. Relational aggression is talking behind people's back, stabbing people in the back, trying to cause arguments with people. And I already mentioned that they tend to have a history of victimization in their own life. When it comes to racial and ethnic differences, most research on psychopaths is done on white males, because white males tend to be the population that has this behavioral pattern more than any other population. No real difference between white and African Americans, although African American psychopaths are less impulsive than white psychopaths. Concerns exist over how term psychopath could influence sentencing, especially with the death penalty and with racial minorities. The juvenile psychopath. Can a juvenile psychopath be identified? Well, remember, we cannot diagnose somebody under the age of 18 with antisocial personality disorder, but can psychopathy be found in children? Most research, of course, is done on adult white males, but we have found that the behavioral patterns that we find in adult psychopaths can be found in juveniles as well. Remember, that would probably be those juveniles who have already been diagnosed with conduct disorder. So current research supports the concept that these behaviors can be found in juveniles. Again, we don't like to label juveniles as psychopaths or with antisocial personality disorder, so instead they would be diagnosed with conduct disorder, tend to have a history of ADD or ADHD. Those are kind of reliable predictors and features of juveniles that are displaying this behavioral pattern. Research does suggest the types of behaviors remain stable from age 7 to at least 24. So the truth is, if you have a juvenile teenager who is displaying these kind of core traits of psychopathy, you're not going to change. Psychopathy cannot be treated. HARE does have a juvenile checklist test that was listed on a previous slide. There's definitely ethical concerns with labeling. We've already talked about how labeling can be kind of dangerous and cause people to treat others differently. There's kind of self-fulfilling prophecy involved with labeling. So if you label a juvenile as a psychopath and they know and understand that, they could start to believe that about themselves, and that will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So there are a lot of ethical considerations with labeling juveniles. And when it comes to treatment options, most researchers do not believe that psychopathy can be treated. It is, part of a personality disorder, and a personality disorder like antisocial personality disorder is basically having a set of maladaptive personality traits, and that cannot be treated. Now, there are people out there who do believe that you can treat psychopathy in both juveniles and adults. There's a great book called Character Disturbance by I forget the doctor's name, but he's a clinical psychiatrist, and he does believe that that it's kind of a treatable set of traits, but the vast majority of people do not believe that it can be treated. Here are some of the different tools that can be used to screen for, again, a psychopathic behavioral pattern in juveniles, but we would be very careful about labeling a juvenile as a psychopath. Of course, it would be definitely a red flag if you have a juvenile that has been diagnosed with conduct disorder and is displaying these behavioral patterns, because the truth is they're probably going to continue on into adulthood. So, neurobiological factors and psychopathy. This is where it gets really interesting. The general public tends to think that psychopaths are the result of social factors or abuse or poor parenting, but research has identified biological factors as well. The current view is that psychopathy is the result of a complicated interaction of psychological factors and or learning early in childhood. So when it comes to some of the neurobiological factors, and I'm going to talk about a guy named James Fallon in a minute. When it comes to genetics, temperament, we've already talked about how temperament is highly genetic, and there's some evidence that suggests temperament low in arousal and fear responses could disrupt the ability to feel guilt and remorse and shame and all of those things. Current trends in twin studies should give us more conclusive answers if issues with temperament and low reactivity are impeding the development of those, the ability to feel those things. With the central nervous system, the central nervous system is derived of your brain and spinal cord, by the way. We do have two hemispheres to our brain, a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is involved, among other things, for understanding emotion and communications. Hare and Conley proposed that criminal psychopaths have abnormal balance between the two hemispheres. The left hemisphere seems to be deficient in linguistic processing because they do not rely on verbal information the way that most people do. Less accurate at reading emotions on other people's faces. They have what's called an emotional paradox, an inability to experience emotions like most people do. They can talk about emotions, but they lack the ability to apply them to real life, and that's involved in the right hemisphere. Deficits in the frontal lobe. Remember, the frontal lobe is the executive seat of the brain and includes all of our higher order processes. It is the last part of the brain to develop, if you remember that. Imaging shows deficits in the frontal lobes, which is, of course, the executive seat of the brain. Low ability to make good decisions, low self-control, problems with rational thought, flexibility, and regulation of impulse control. The amygdala, remember we talked about the amygdala, it's a small almond-shaped cluster of neurons that are deep inside the limbic system in the brain. And remember, that's the emotional seat of the brain. And we talked about how the amygdala is responsible for a lot of our negative emotional responses. So it is responsible for fear, anger, disgust, and some aspects of aggression. And it has been tied to the callous, unemotional traits that tend to be part of psychopathy. Now, here's where it gets interesting. There is a man named James Fallon. All right, so as I was saying, there's a man named James Fallon. This is James Fallon right here. James Fallon is a researcher out at the University of California at Irvine, and he does brain research. And he was doing research on all types of neurological issues, but focusing a lot on Alzheimer's, on the brains of Alzheimer patients. And every once in a while, he would have a colleague in California have him scan the brain of a convicted killer. California has a lot of very famous serial killers, and it's suggested that Fallon actually scanned the brain of a lot of the convicted serial killers out in California. In doing all of these scans kind of on the side, he noticed that there was a specific pattern with the brains of these convicted killers who we would suggest have the behavioral pattern associated with being a psychopath and the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. So in kind of discovering this pattern, Fallon decided he needed some control brains. And so he decided to scan a group of normal brains so that he could compare them to this brain pattern that he had identified with psychopaths. And he did his own family's brains as control groups. When he got the scans back, and there were no names on them, that's how you do studies, he noticed that one of the brains was abnormal, and it had the same pattern that he had identified in psychopaths. So that's what this image is here. So he actually, once he saw this, he thought that there might be something wrong with the machine. They checked the machine, it was fine. And he ended up opening the names on these scans. These are his family members, and they all have normal brains. This is his brain. This is the brain pattern that he has identified with psychopaths. He has the brain pattern. And so that kind of prompted him to become an expert in the brains of psychopaths. And he wrote this book, excuse me, A Neuroscientist's Personal Journey into the Dark Side of the Brain, called The Psychopath Inside. And it's about him kind of going through his own history and looking at his behavior and his ability to connect with other people and his ability to feel emotions. And he discovered that he absolutely has all of those behavioral patterns associated with being a psychopath. He just never crossed the line into becoming a criminal psychopath. So then he started looking at, well, what's the difference between, me having this brain pattern and these convicted killers having this brain pattern? And he determined that it is early childhood experiences. And he believes, by the way, that this is probably highly genetic, that people are born with this brain pattern, and they either, during childhood, if they have a normal, loving childhood, the brain pattern is still there, but the criminal aspect doesn't flip that switch on, so to speak. And he had a very loving childhood. And so he still has the behavioral pattern associated with psychopathy. He is just not a criminal psychopath. But he suggests that people born with this behavioral pattern, and again, he believes it's genetic, who have dysfunctional or abusive childhood, that flips that switch on, and they're more likely to become that criminal psychopath. So inside D2L is a link to a video on James Fallon, where he talks about his experiences and his research. He's incredibly interesting. And, when you watch him, he's very engaging to listen to. And remember, I talked about psychopaths are very charming and they're very engaging. And he has that that kind of charisma that draws you in. But he's very honest about his own behavior and his own experience. So he's fascinating, and he's become kind of the leading research on the brains of psychopaths. So he suggested that it is these problems during childhood that flip this brain pattern and this kind of genetic brain pattern on. So he has found, and others have found, that with psychopaths in childhood, we have hyperactivity, impulsive behaviors, attention deficit problems, conduct problems, problems with parents, abuse, neglect, negative school experiences, and they tend to be those life course persistent offenders. And remember, life course persistent offenders are those who get in trouble very early, persist all through childhood and adolescence, and then continues into adulthood. I mentioned that there is no known treatment for adults with psychopathy. I mentioned a book earlier called Character Disturbance, and the doctor's name is George K. Simon, and he is one of those people that do believe that that you can treat psychopaths. But I have to be honest with you, the vast majority of people do not believe that a psychopath can be treated. There is no therapy for it. There is no medication. Now, there is some suggestion with adolescents and children who are displaying some of these behavioral patterns. So they have had some success with recidivism rates with inpatient treatment for children and early adolescents that includes cognitive behavioral therapy on a daily basis, setting goals, learning coping skills. A 2001 study found some improvement after a year of in-treatment. So this is very long and intensive treatment, and this would be early childhood, by the way. 42% of the boys and 45% of the girls in this particular study made marked to moderate improvement with their display of these psychopathic behavioral patterns. With adults, there is no treatment, and it's questionable whether the treatment will work for juveniles, and if it does, it would be with early intervention. Children and adolescents have a distinct set of emotional and cognitive deficits that lead to violent and antisocial behavior, and we've already talked about the causes of some of those cognitive deficits. It's all of those early, really red flag behaviors in childhood and adolescent that typically tend to lead to conduct disorder, and then into adulthood with antisocial personality disorder. So, super interesting chapter. I think that you'll really like the information in the chapter. Make sure you watch that James Fallon video. It is fascinating. And again, we have the psychopathy checklist in D2L, as well as the diagnostic and statistical manual for criteria for being diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, all in D2L. Let me know if you have any questions on the chapter. Otherwise,